So this is my freedom of speech in American media presentation. So I'll start with an overview of sort of freedom of speech in general. It's one of the most highly debated topics um, among the First Amendment rights today. We talk about it pretty much every day to this day within the country and just within democracies around the country. Freedom of speech is a big talking point. Um, so this presentation is going to focus on sort of the infringement on speech rights, and I'm going to look into four specific topics. Those topics are going to be politics, the social media aspect, protests, and also college campuses effects on that. So I'll talk a little bit more about that with the lineup. In terms of politics, you have things like lobbying, you have things like you know, people, money essentially affecting the freedom of speech in terms of what people can ultimately say. Social media, I think we all kind of get that one today with the way that owners and such, own specific apps and can regulate and mediate what's going on in there. Protests is one of the easiest ways for people to speak out against government or companies or whatever. So we'll talk about that, and then college campuses, which play a huge role in the next generation of people and what they think. And being in college right now, there's definitely classes that affect the way people are going to look at certain issues in the world based on the professor and different speakers that we may have. So, in terms of politics, we'll start with speech protection, and in politics, um, there's a lot of First Amendment protection. It's very important in political, um, debating and such, to be able to say what you feel and what you want. Obviously, that can get, tricky. I have this Yale Law article here that talks about sort of the protection that democracy has on, or freedom of speech has protection in a democracy politically, because it's so important for political leaders to be able to speak out. But then you get into some of the interesting topics when it comes to money, which was my next slide here. And money plays a huge role, obviously, in politics today. Based on lobbying, it's legal in the U.S. And it really kind of affects the way politicians are able to speak on certain things because their funding is coming from somewhere. I have this political cartoon on the right, um, just showing sort of all the money that's dumped into what politicians are saying. And, people will say it helps, others will say it hurts. It's kind of the big debate on the money in politics, going against free speech. I have linked a Citizens United versus FEC court case, which was basically corporate spending rights to take over the political speech of politicians. And it was a big case that had a lot of money involved, which leads me into my main example, and that is NRA versus VULO or VULO. Um, so the NRA is the National Rifle Association. And it basically, what they did was they claimed that New York officials were pressuring companies to cut ties with the NRA because of what they stood for. And the Supreme Court said government officials cannot use threats to silence viewpoints. And this was a big step because it meant that the government could step in and say, um, you can't buy your way out of letting someone preach their viewpoint with the NRA in New York. And this was really important because it essentially gave precedent to people being able to go to the government if their viewpoint is being suppressed by money, um, whether it's companies or the government. This was a pretty big example of that happening in 2024. Um, so, the government can disagree with a viewpoint, but they can't come down on you for it unless it's, specifically harming someone or coming at someone, or they think it poses a threat to national security or something along those lines. They can't come after it. The NRA obviously was not doing that. Um, so the First Amendment protects that in this case, and the government, or Supreme Court, I should say, agreed with the standpoint of the NRA. So, moving on to social media, which is probably my favorite topic here because social media is an everyday use for me and pretty much everyone, not just my generation, but all generations at this point, whether it's Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or whatever you use, X, I should say. It's a very polarizing topic in terms of freedom of speech. Um, Political debates online are everywhere. You can't avoid them as much as you try, which sucks. Platforms, the big problem, the big debate that we'll get into is that platforms owned by specific people can push specific narratives based on algorithms. And this is kind of a problem in today's society, obviously, because you're not really getting both sides. You're getting these echo chambers. Um, so it's really important that people are able to understand each platform's regulations and be able to, if they feel they're being suppressed, their speech, or they're being unfairly treated on a platform based on their viewpoint, that they can come down on these companies, which is shown in the examples that I'll give. So, moving on to just another slide, kind of specifically about the privatization of social media. Obviously, X or Twitter, Elon Musk, he's considered a right wing, you know, viewpoints. He has right wing viewpoints. And Mark Zuckerberg, who recently has sort of come back on it, but has typically, or traditionally, I should say, been a left leaning, um, had left leaning viewpoints, or at least was bought by the left. And that sort of helped Instagram and Facebook, the two companies that he now owns. He bought Instagram, obviously. That really sort of was a platform, two platforms where the left was more prominent and now X is more prominent right. And you sort of get that same sort of effect, if you will, of, you know, political debate, but it wasn't on the same platform. So moving to the example that I chose, which is Moody versus NetChoice in 2024. It was essentially about Florida and Texas passing laws limiting how platforms can actually moderate what's on their platforms. It was sort of a court case to limit the power of private ownership on these social media apps. And the Supreme Court said content moderation can involve judgment. And that's the big gray area here. And that's why this debate is so hot right now, because it's left to the platforms to judge. And when you have leaders who have certain biases and viewpoints, it really can push the other side down. So that's kind of the big debate. And I have the Supreme Court article linked here. But essentially, this case just showed the debate has some power, but also the platform owner has as much power based on what the Supreme Court went with. And this is just a continued slide. I have pictures of some of the owners of these companies and the judge there. And the big thing is that users and people on these platforms just want to, most people want to get both viewpoints and be able to freely speak, which is obviously the topic of the slideshow. They want to be able to freely speak their opinions and thoughts in their own area on each platform, which can't necessarily happen now, but the big states are starting to come after these platforms and really investigate the practices that Zuckerberg or Musk or these other owners, have. Which leads me into protests. This one, obviously um, a huge way to show your beliefs, and it's a there are certain limits to it, but it is a very visible form of that speech and First Amendment expression. And there's a lot of protections that it has, peaceful marches, signs, chants, stuff like that. I mentioned the Edwards versus South Carolina case, which gave protection to students who protested. Obviously, um, that relates pretty heavily to college, which I'm obviously in right now. But there's also limits. You can't just go around doing anything you want at these protests. And there's some judgment involved, similar to the social media platforms, in terms of what you can and can't do. Pedestrian traffic is on there. The government could step in and regulate safety if they feel there is a safety concern, which is, obviously something people would want the government to do. Which leads me into my example, another recent example, Colombia protest encampment in 2024 about Gaza and Palestine. It's a still debated topic. Columbia students were camping out on the lawns, and the NYPD was eventually called and stepped in and cleared it. But there's obviously debate whether or not that's fair, if they should clear it. But it is not a public campus. So ultimately, Columbia had the authority to clear everyone out if they wanted to, which they did do. But it's a highly debated topic. And just a little bit more on it. It's a core, First Amendment protection. And when it comes to speech at these protests, you can pretty much say anything you want without threatening people. Um, and it's important to, I think, just through the research I've done, understand that protests, especially on college campuses like this example, are important to stemming discussion in the media, good and bad. So it's really important that protests continue under the First Amendment. And into the last example, college campuses. These are, I titled it True Battlegrounds, kind of like that Columbia example. It's really, really, really important when it comes to protests and freedom of speech and learning. A lot of that goes through college campuses. That's a generational thing. Um, Colleges are a great place for debate, to research and understand controversial things. Just here in Oklahoma, I can give an example. Being from New Hampshire, coming to Oklahoma, learning about the Native American history here. It's a really, that's a tough topic. That's a controversial topic, but it's important to learn it and understand it. At least the facts that can be backed up. But obviously, there is debate. As I'll move on here, debate, controversial speakers, professors as well. Biases that come into play when you're talking about um, controversial topics. You're going to get some bias in there. I know here at OU, I've had classes where I felt the professor could be biased towards one side or the other of a story, and I think everyone has bias. Obviously, in journalism, you learn that, and it's important to understand what's factual, what's true, and then what's opinion, or where someone's stepping in and giving some extra details that maybe fit a narrative. So that's important, and that's why I think a lot of guest speakers can be controversial, which was my example. Stanford Law had a controversial judge, Kyle Duncan, who was invited to speak at the law school, and people protested, used their protesting rights, and it became, a big debate and topic online. Um, you know, and the protest obviously is protected, but also the speaker is protected because he has the right to his own opinion. And if Stanford wants him to speak, he is obviously allowed to speak. Doesn't mean you have to go or listen, but it's sort of, people may not like controversial speakers, but it's ultimately up to college leadership who they would like to have speak. And this is just more on that example. Students can protest, obviously, but schools can fight back or limit disruptions based on their viewpoints, which is why a lot of people feel colleges are biased and, bought out by certain people, debated, obviously. But it's very important that both sides, both protesters and the speaker, get the right to their freedom of speech. So, just to conclude on this whole presentation, why it's important, essentially, it's huge. It's a huge importance in all the things that we look at today: politics, social media, protesting, and college. Literally, what we're in. It's very important that we have our freedom of speech to, um, you know, be able to express ourselves verbally and um, it can be hard at times to be unbiased. It's the big debate. It's the big topic. What should be allowed to be said in these on these platforms and at college campuses. And a lot of people feel like there should be government regulation, but the reality is the First Amendment gives private companies, gives people the right to free speech, so long as it's not threatening anyone, and that's really important to this day because it allows us to uncover truths and lies and do what journalists do. So that's all I have. Thank you for listening.